Welcome back to Duck Badger Radio and a conversation with Randy Woodley. Randy is a professor at George Fox University in Portland and also the director of the Intercultural and Indigenous Studies program there. And Randy, I want to talk to you a little bit about that whole idea of the indigenous people and how they live in a culture. It doesn't seem that anywhere in the world that has gone very well, where the indigenous people groups have been able to live well with the latecomers, and certainly in the United States. So we have this story of Thanksgiving, but then we have the story of today. And like we were mentioning earlier, people feel so conflicted about how it got from there to here, and how are we supposed to think about it and all. How do you think about the engagement between indigenous peoples in the United States and the other? I don't even know if we should refer to it as the other culture. I mean, that's one of the things I want to ask you about is how should we talk about these kinds of issues?
Yeah, so we could just say settlers.
Yeah. Well, because see, here's what I think is funny. I mean, like for people like me, like I don't know, my family came somewhere in the mid 1600s to middle 1800s on both sides, and so I don't feel like I mean, I was born in Minnesota, right? So I don't feel like a settler, and I've been narrated a story of my life, which sort of begins kind of with my parents, but really with my own birth and then going forward. And I don't really see myself as being at all connected to the peoples of my great-great-great-grandparents who came here. So do you find that a lot with people, that they're like, man, indigenous folks, they talk about this real long line, and I don't think about my life like that at all.
Yeah, well, I think there's several streams contributing to that. One is a theological problem, and that is basically the idea that most European cultures have disconnected themselves from their own myths and stories.
Yeah.
Not being able to find God in those as a theological dictate, and in Protestantism especially, but in Catholicism too. And when you separate yourself from that, then you have to find something. And so what have, white folks in America done? They've said, we're the Hebrews. That's our ancient connection. So everything that happened to the Hebrews is it, and they've made that the primary connection. And that everybody else is a secondary. So when other cultures, indigenous cultures around the world, come along and say, no, God has been active in covenant relationship with us for thousands and thousands of years, and we have stories, and we have ceremonies, and we have revelations that all attribute to that, there's a theological problem.
Interesting.
And the problem is with the Western mind and its ability to sort of think out of the silos. And so those silos teach us things like our history begins, with the Pilgrims. When, in fact, what I would rather teach, and what I do teach, is that because you come to America, your history began here about 40,000 years ago. And here's what the people of your continent were doing for 40,000 years before you got here.
So you're trying to say don't give up the heritage that you've come from, but acknowledge that if you're a North American, that you now are part of a much larger story, a much larger family that's been here all along.
Yeah, so that silo says, start 510 years ago. And what I'm saying is, no, if you're coming to this country, we have a long history of relationships, ceremonies, tribes, languages, stories about the Creator and how creators work through our lives, and somehow you need to get connected to that story as part of your story. And so, to use a kind of a quaint phrase, but just kind of get the idea across, to be adopted into the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, because here in Minnesota, we have made decisions about allowing for indigenous people to operate casinos, and it generates a significant amount of money for some of the tribes here. In fact, the radio station here, you often hear ads for the Shakopee Mid-Wacaton Sioux community and the good things that they're doing with the money that they're earning through these casinos. So there seems to be this sense, at least in places like Minnesota, and I know other places around the country that have these casino solutions for the reservations, to try to say, well, okay, so we solved the discrimination problem because now they get a break where they don't have to pay federal taxes and they can have separate rules that allow them to run casinos. Do you hear that kind of thing happening a lot too, where people feel like, man, it's 2011. Are we not done with the discrimination narratives yet?
Sure. Well, there's so many bad rumors about the casinos. The most tribes don't have casinos, and most of the tribes that do have casinos don't make a profit on those casinos. And the other thing is that these are the casinos. Although, as we're supposed to be sovereign nations, is supposed to be our status, but until we get moved from the Department of the Interior, which is all flora and fauna, right, and to the State Department, I don't think we'll actually ever be recognized as sovereign nations and people. So that would be, that's one of the political goals I think we should have as Native people and as Americans, to recognize us for who we are. So we have a right to have those places, but remember, our values are not based on capitalism.
Oh, I see.
They're not on capitalistic values and the same. And so when we say, oh, look at they're successful, I would say, no, look at that number one, we've either failed miserably, or number two option is that we have learned how to play the white man's game in order to get the money to use it for our values, which is probably, I hope, the long-term goal. Because the truth is that this is a short-term solution. Casinos are. So.
Yeah, and in fact, I think that some of the poorest counties or poorest areas in the United States are often on or around Indian lands and Indian reservations. Is that true?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. The usually out of the 10 poorest counties in the United States, usually 6 or 7 are in Indian country. Most of them in South Dakota. And there's no casinos out there because there's no traffic. Most of the time, places like Pine Ridge, which is probably the worst state of any, it's the worst of the worst. It's 2.5 hours to the closest city, and which is Rapid City, South Dakota. So you practically so unemployment is like 80%. My wife's reservation, where unemployment is 60-70% in Wyoming.
Well, I would love to chat when we come back about the role of Christianity in indigenous groups, and then also your thoughts on how should indigenous groups be a part of the broader culture, because a lot of the rest of us have been told the story of the melting pot philosophy of coming from where you are, and then you come to the United States and you make a whole new place. And so after the break, can we chat about that idea?
Yeah, let's talk about how Indians are going to, number one, rescue the theology of American church, and two, they're going to save America.
That would be awesome. That's Dr. Randy Woodley. He is an associate professor of faith and culture at George Fox University in Portland and the director of the Intercultural and Indigenous Studies program there. And we'll chat about those things here after the break on Doug Badger Radio on AM 950. Doug Badger.